Hi, and welcome to episode 81 of the Breaking Bio podcast. I'm Morgan Jackson, a PhD student at the University of Guelph. This week it's just me, nobody else to introduce. So, we'll hope this goes well. Luckily, I'm not all by myself, however, because I do have a guest this week, as always. This week we're joined by Dr. Alex Bond, who is not a newcomer to the show. He appeared almost a year to the date, actually, on the show last year. So we're going to talk to him, find out what he's been up to in the last 12 months or so. And I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So if you haven't heard the old episode, though, Alex is the senior conservation scientist at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, based out of the UK. He's all about the bird nerding and does all sorts of cool stuff. So Alex, welcome back to Breaking Bio. Thanks a lot for joining us again. Brilliant.
Thanks for having me back, Morgan.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure, as always, to have somebody so interested in natural history come back on the show. So it's been a year. We kind of left off the last episode that we talked to you about. Maybe we'll come back and find out how the year went. We're there. It's like we follow through with our promises on a regular basis. This is the all-new Breaking Bio. So what's up? What have you been up to for the last year?
So in the last 12 months, I ended my job as a postdoc in the government of Canada. I moved from Saskatchewan to the UK with my family, including a cat, and then promptly went to the most remote inhabited island on the face of the earth.
That's how far away you had to get from Saskatchewan.
Look, the prairie was lovely, but I needed a hill.
I don't blame you. So we're going to start there because really, if you get a chance to talk to somebody who's been to one of the most, if not the most remotely inhabited places on Earth, you talk to them about what it's like to be in the most remote place on Earth. So what was this? Where is this remote location that you're at?
So I went to, so part of my job here at the RSPB, the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, is dealing with wildlife and conservation issues in what are called the UK overseas territories. So these are the bits of empire that are still scattered around, that are still part of the United Kingdom. So not places like Canada or New Zealand that still have the Queen as head of state, but places like Montserrat, British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Pitcairn Islands in the South Pacific, and Ascension, St. Helena, and Tristan da Cunha, which are in the South Atlantic Ocean. So I flew from London down to Cape Town, hopped on a boat in August. So think it's the Southern Hemisphere, so all the seasons are flipped. So that's like flying to the Northern Hemisphere and getting on a boat in February. And promptly spent 11 of the worst days of my life transiting over 3,000 kilometers to get to Tristan da Cunha, which is it is the most remote inhabited place on the face of the earth.
All right, so we're gonna talk about this some more because how big? Just give us an idea. So it's an 11-day boat ride from South Africa to get there, which gives you an idea that it's a really freaking middle of nowhere. But how big is this island? Is this something that you could walk across in a day, or is this something that you have transport on the island?
So the island is 96 square kilometers. It's basically a circle, roughly 12 kilometers in diameter. But it's also got a ridiculously tall, over 2,000 meter peak right in the middle. So it's almost a perfect peak conical volcano in the middle of the ocean. So you probably could walk across it in a day, but I wouldn't recommend it.
It wouldn't be a very pleasant walk, is what you're saying.
It might be very pleasant at all, but it would be challenging. Bring good ankle support would be key.
Good ankle support. That's good. So let's go back to this 11-day boat ride. So are you a nautical person in normal circumstances? Never mind winter through what is conceived by many as one of the worst oceans in the world.
Yeah, so Tristan is just barely above what's called the Roaring 40s, which are between 40 and 50 south. So Tristan's at 37, so it's getting pretty darn close to the fun zone. Am I a nautical person? Yeah, I mean, so I work on seabird islands, and I've done that in Newfoundland and in Alaska and in Australia, which almost inevitably involves some degree of boat travel, which is fine. I get on the boat, I sleep the first night, I wake up the first morning, I vomit off the back deck, and then I'm fine for the rest of the trip. Except on this one, where I spent 3 consecutive days in my bunk eating the thinnest sliced bread you have ever seen in your life.
That was it.
Yeah, that was it for 3 days. I literally had to bring my belt in an additional notch when I got to the island.
Oh, Jesus. That is a terrible situation. I can't imagine feeling that poorly on a boat with nowhere to go. And knowing that you still have a week left of it after that.
But yeah, on the whole, it's pretty tough to get out there. So we were on the boats that go out there are combination of fishing, cargo, and passenger vessels. So they do sort of all in one. So I was on the fishing stroke, cargo stroke, passenger vessel. So it goes out to Tristan where they have fishery for the rock lobster that's endemic to the island group, which you can now incidentally buy in the UK and have at the finest Parisian restaurants. Oh,
well, there you go. So you in Paris, those are kind of connected.
through lobster.
Through lobster, there you go. So obviously you weren't there for lobsters, although I imagine it was probably handy to have them, at arm's reach at times. But what were you there for?
Yeah, it was a really nice sort of a byproduct of being on the island. So I was actually not going specifically to Tristan at first. I went to another island called Gough, which is another 300 kilometers away. And there's a South African weather station there. And as part of the overwintering team, so they get dropped off in September. And then the ship goes away. And then comes back next September.
And sees who's still alive.
And hopefully it's all of them. And switches out the crew. So we went down on what's called the takeover, so where the crews switch out and they do maintenance on the base. And Gough is this amazing, brilliant island, 65 square kilometers, 24 breeding seabird species, millions and millions of individuals. We found a new breeding species on the island this year. But the catch is there are mice, and they've been there since the late 1800s. And they're completely decimating the albatross. So the mice eat the albatross chicks alive in, on average, about 4 days. Ooh. Now keep in mind, the mice are just regular house mice, but they're bigger. They're almost twice the size of a typical mouse, which is still only about 40 or 50 grams. But they are the main predator of these 8 and 9 kilogram albatross chicks during the austral winter.
So you've got a double-sized mouse, which is still relatively small, eating a dog-sized bird in 4 days.
It doesn't eat the whole bird, but it eats through the body wall enough to kill the bird. Yeah,
people are the worst, man.
Typical albatross breeding success. If you go to any other island in the southern hemisphere with these sort of great albatrosses, without introduced predators, is about 70%. And when we get to the island, we walk around the whole island and count chicks in about 8 or 9 different areas. It's pretty much a complete census. When they did the count back in January, so they also take 11 months to actually raise a chick.
Oh, 11 months to raise 4 days for a mouse to eat. That's not going to end well.
So the mice don't eat them when they're 4 days old. They eat them when they're about 2-3 months old. But yeah, it still takes 4 days. But when they counted all the breeding pairs, so the number of breeding attempts on the island last January, there was about 1,700 nests, and when we counted the chicks, we had 163.
10%?
So 9.5.
Holy smokes. 90% of the chicks are being eaten every year by mice. Well,
so about 30% of the nests will fail naturally. So either parents aren't very good, they're young parents, or just the egg doesn't hatch, it's not fertile, or the chick dies from exposure. So that's typical what you would see. But yeah, the other
60%
are
Jesus.
Yeah, likely the effect of rats. So, and this is an albatross that breeds only on this island and is declining.
For obvious
Critically
reasons.
endangered. Yeah, well, yeah, and they get caught in bycatch. So,
well, at least you got to see them. So, I mean, there's maybe a little bit of a bright. That's a terrible. There's no bright side. That's a terrible situation. So, is there anything going on to try and rid this island of mice?
So that's actually what my job is to provide the science to this program. So we've made our case. So the RSPB is a members organization. We're a society. So we have a management structure and we have a board, and we've made our proposals to them, and they're hopefully going to decide in the next couple of months if it's going to go ahead. So if it does, it's going to be ridiculously expensive because it's so far away. But yeah, I think the stakes are really high, and something's gotta happen. I haven't told you about the other petrels that live on the island, where the chicks survive 7 hours
before they're consumed by the mice.
On average,
the mice are getting to them within 7 hours.
Yeah, so it's almost 4 o'clock your time. So while you've been at work, that's the average lifespan of an Atlantic petrel chick.
Mickey has got some serious explaining to do. That is not the side of mice that Disney is going to be putting out on. That is horrifying. So you need to build some better mouse traps, is what you're finding. Jesus. Yeah. So are you, when you're walking around this island, and maybe I'm just wrong here, but is it almost just like mice everywhere? Like as you're walking, it's just kind of like mice scattering across the island, or are they a little more sneaky than that?
Yeah, so they're nocturnal primarily. So we're not usually out walking in the middle of the night because it's a rough terrain island, and if you aren't on the path, you're likely getting stuck in vegetation up to your eyeballs. So, but yeah, if you're out walking, occasionally you'll see one scurry away.
Wow, that is incredibly intense.
Yeah.
So how do you, as a bird nerd, like I said, that's got to be pretty tough to go into this crazy remote place that you've literally given up, inches of your waistline to get to, only to find.
Good way of putting it.
Yeah, only to find, the habitat is being, and the native fauna, the unique native fauna, is getting destroyed. There's really no other adjective.
No, that's it. I mean, and Gulf is so far away. I mean, in addition to all of the birds, it's got at least 6 endemic inverts, including 2 flightless moths, plus another 8 group endemics, so endemic to the Tristan group, plus another 10 species that could possibly be endemics, but we haven't quite worked them out yet. Plus all of the plants, 43% of the mosses are endemic.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's not just the birds. I mean, it's the whole ecosystem gets totaled when you have introduced predators like this.
No doubt.
On an island. So it can be very depressing. So I did my PhD on an island that had rats in it in Alaska. So I've been, I won't say desensitized because this was particularly brutal. But yeah, you sort of know what you're in for. Doesn't make it any easier, but yeah. Now, so I sort of see my work as being providing the scientific basis so that we can restore these ecosystems to what they should actually be like. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, mice and rats are, I've held them in my hand. They're lovely animals. They're beautiful. They're intelligent. They're remarkable. They just don't belong there. So, yeah. So it's my job to sort of figure out how we can get them off of there.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you're the Pied Piper in this instance. You should get a little business card, Pied Piper for the most remote island in the world.
I'll put in the request.
There you go. I'm sure they'll fund that. Just tell them that I think it's a good idea, and they'll give it.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
So that's what you spent 6 months doing, essentially, was going through and figuring out just how badly the ecosystem is in these cases. So now you came back to the UK, and you're pitching this idea to your subscribers and your members. You're hoping to go back again in the fall to continue monitoring, or to start doing something if the proposal is funded.
Yeah. So we've been gathering evidence on Gough in particular since 2000, and the plan ultimately will depend on whether or not we have a decision from our governing bodies over the summer. So we have an annual monitoring program that goes on Gough. So that looks at breeding success and survival and population densities of a number of key species. So we'll shortly be recruiting for those positions. So I go down during the takeover and essentially get them set up for the year, regardless of what the ultimate decision will be. Yeah, so that'll be next, or rather this September, shockingly, in 5 months.
We won't think about that. We'll just continue to put it off, because I can't afford for September to be 5 months away already. That's crazy. So then you'll spend another 5 or 6 months down in the middle of nowhere again, and
so I'm only on Gough for 1 month, and the rest of the 2.5 months I'm on the main island of Tristan, where we work with the conservation department down there to build capacity and work on their monitoring program for mostly albatrosses and penguins that are on the main island.
Okay, so keeping track of other stuff as well. So does Tristan da Cunha have rat and mice problems as well, or are they not as hardly affected?
Yeah, so the main group of islands is actually 3. So there's Tristan, and then about 40 kilometers away, there's another island called Nightingale, and another one sort of in a triangle-esque. It's a really bad triangle. There we go. Yeah, it's a good thing I'm not an engineer. Called Inaccessible.
That's
Island.
the name. The island is literally called Inaccessible?
The island's name is Inaccessible Island.
That is right. Nail on the head right there. Yeah,
it does what it says on the tin. So Tristan itself has about 260, 270 people that live on it.
Year-round.
So permanent residents of the island.
Wow.
It's been inhabited for just shy of 200 years. And so there's agriculture and domestic animals there, as well as rats, black rats, and house mice. But Inaccessible and Nightingale are predator-free.
Oh.
So we do a bit of work on both of those, despite the name. We can get over to Inaccessible. It's just very tricky. And we do a bit of work on Tristan, on some of the birds that are up at higher elevations, like 600 to 800 meters.
Cool. So lots of stuff going on out in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, it's shocking when you actually boil down to it. Between that and sort of working with the conservation department, who are absolutely fantastic, and do a lot of ridiculously hard work even when we're not there. It's incredibly rewarding, and it's a lot of fun, and you get to do a lot of fantastic hiking, and just the folks on Tristan are amazing. They just welcome you right into the community. So you show up on the boat, and before you get up to wherever you're staying, you've got someone who's left you dinner and dessert for the next 8 days, because there's so much of it. So it's really wonderful, and I can't wait to get back.
That's awesome. Well, you answered my question. I was going to say there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of emotional heartbreak when you see these terrible situations going on. But what are the perks? The perks are 8 days of food and dessert waiting for you right off the terrible boat ride. That's not a bad perk.
Yeah, no, I mean, the perks are really doing applied on the ground, like boots on the ground conservation work, and knowing that what I'm doing is going to improve the situation of the islands, hopefully, fingers crossed, and just the amazing privilege of getting to go there, because it's so remote. I'm incredibly lucky. Just not taking, you don't take something like that for granted. The fact that you get to go to Gough or Tristan several years in a row, it's pretty amazing.
That's pretty cool. Not many people can say that they get to go to the most remotely inhabited location on Earth several times.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. You have to put a little number up on their population chart saying 1 1/3 or whatever for Alex.
They do actually on their website. They do keep track of the expats that are on the island as well. So yeah, it's all kept to strict account.
That's awesome. That's very good. I suppose it's good so they know who's on the island when the big wave comes across. But it's always good to know. All right, so we're gonna flip poles. Actually, we're gonna go from one hemisphere totally to the other end of it, and we're gonna talk about some new research that you just had out about a month ago, right? Talking about mercury poisoning and mercury accumulation in a group of birds called ivory gulls found way up in the Arctic.
Yeah. So this was a project. It was my very first project as a postdoc. So I finished my PhD at Memorial University in Newfoundland. I moved several thousand kilometers to the prairies, to Saskatoon, to the U of S, University of Saskatchewan. And I was sitting in my office and I thought, what would be a really, really cool project? And my supervisor was also in Environment Canada, so I thought it'd be really cool to have this sort of management, policy type bent to it. And so I was thinking, my background was in Mercury, in birds. That's what I did my master's in. And I thought, like Mercury in birds, like what do we need to know? And I thought, ivory gulls. So these are these amazing birds. They're pure white birds with black legs, and they live in the Arctic. They're really associated with the ice pack. So even in the winter, because it's practically always winter where they are, they come down to the edge of the ice pack during the non-breeding season. So they're really affiliated with the sea ice and with nunataks in the high Arctic, these sort of snow-free areas. They nest really dispersed across the Canadian Arctic, Greenland, Spitsbergen, and Arctic Russia. And in Canada, they've tanked about 80% since the 1980s. So we've only got about 500 pairs left. And in their eggs, so we've been monitoring, Canadian Wildlife Service has been monitoring their eggs for contaminants during about 3 periods from about the mid-70s, and the last one was 2004. And they found the highest level of mercury in any Arctic bird egg in ivory gull eggs from Canada.
Wow.
And amongst ivory gulls, the ones from Canada have the highest mercury. So it's like the double whammy. So we thought, yeah, brilliant, exactly. Just what they needed. And the reason for this is because they've got this really cool diet. So they eat scavenged marine mammals. So when polar bears haul out a seal kill on the ice, or a whale beaches, or anything like that, these are the top scavengers. So they're exposed to high levels of contaminants that have bioaccumulated and biomagnified up the food chain. So we thought, this is a perfect idea. And so they're listed under COSEWIC, which is under SARA, the Species at Risk Act, as endangered in Canada. And one of the reasons for that was potentially mercury. So I thought, this is a perfect project. So knowing that it's ridiculously expensive to work in the high Arctic and the logistics are almost impossible, and then catching the ivory gulls is a whole other layer on top of that, we thought, where can we get our hands on some ivory gulls to test this theory? And the answer, natural history museums. So these amazing archives in which you are sitting, for example, have lots of specimens. And so we got specimens from, I can't name them all, but literally from St. John's to Victoria, and almost everywhere in between. Manitoba, Ontario, a couple places in the US, and we measured mercury in their feathers from about 1877 up to 2007. So you've got this nice time series as well, which would be completely impossible to do in the field. So the question was, is this high mercury that they've got in their eggs that they're being exposed to, is that a recent phenomenon? In which case it could be linked to their decline. Or because they're high trophic, is this something that they've always been exposed to, and so it's probably less of a concern? So we tried to get this study funded for 3 years. no one would fund it.
Hmm.
So at the end, we just sort of buckled down and found a brilliant collaborator at Western University in London, Brian Branfiren, who ran the analyses for us, and we paid for the rest of it out of our own sort of small research grants, and found that Mercury's gone up 45 times since
Sorry,
the
45
1880s.
times, not 45%, 45
No,
times.
45 times. So from about 0.1 part per million to 4.1 parts per million over 130 years. So it's about a 1.6% increase per year, which is about double the average for the Arctic anyway. So mercury accumulates in the Arctic because that's where all the mercury that gets put up into the atmosphere through coal generation and artisanal gold mining, which are the two main sources. So mercury gets pumped up into the atmosphere and it gets blown around with these atmospheric circulation patterns. And then the stuff from sort of Western North America and Asia just happens, conveniently, or not if you're an ivory gull, gets deposited in the Arctic. And so it works its way up through the sediment and into the food chain, and then from the food chain up to the ivory gulls.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we're getting most of this coal stuff and stuff. This is all not Arctic problems. These are all, places that are generally running, excuse me, things not in the Arctic. And like you said, this is all floating up in through the atmosphere for various climatic and physical reasons. And then I assume because it's got to work its way through the system, there's a lag between when it arrives in the Arctic and when it is arriving inside the gull.
Yeah.
Correct?
Yeah.
What sort of a lag are we thinking here between... that's the big question you guys didn't answer. Sorry.
Yeah. So in terms of what it's actually when the mercury gets up there, that's a complete thumbsuck because it depends on these circulation patterns. It depends on emissions. It depends on about 5 steps of the food chain below ivory gulls. So it's a real guess. But yeah, you're right. There's no like Arctic mercury source that's causing this. It's really a global problem. And these guys are just at the short end of the stick.
Well, that sucks for them a lot. So the one thing that I think a lot of people would be surprised by is that you guys are referring to these gulls, because they're scavengers, as apex predators of a sort. So when those people think of apex predators, they may be thinking of, especially in the Arctic, the symbol of the Arctic, that being the polar bear.
Right. And
you're saying that these guys are on par with them. So is this a similar problem for polar bears? I know we're crossing taxonomic boundaries here, but
they're both vertebrates.
I'm contractually bound to ask about polar bears when we're discussing Arctic conservation. So it's my Canadian duty.
So they have looked at mercury in polar bear hair, which is sort of the functional equivalent of feathers, and structurally as well. So feathers are made of keratin, which is the same as our hair, and that's where a lot of the mercury gets deposited. And the results are, it's a bit of a mixed bag. So some polar bear populations we see higher levels, some we see lower levels, but because there's not 150 years of polar bears sitting around in natural history collections. We unfortunately we can't sort of go back and do the same sort of retrospective type analyses. But yes, they have looked at polar bears, and yes, it is in some populations it is increasing, but probably not as much as in ivory gulls.
All right, screw the polar bears. They're dead to us now. Slightly more,
or at least floating away or swimming away.
Yes, that was part a little too dark, perhaps. So we're going to go back to birds, which isn't as terrible. So is there any idea on what the effect of all this extra mercury in their systems is potentially having? We know that mercury in our systems is bad in certain circumstances and can lead to all sorts of bad things and death and various other degeneracies. But does it have a similar effect on ivory gulls?
Presumably, yeah. So, but the level at which this effect manifests, we really don't know, because there's, just like in humans, there's a lot of variation among individuals. So yeah, so mercury is a neurotoxin. So you know the phrase "mad as a hatter." So that came from 19th century hat makers who were exposed to large amounts of mercury going completely off their rockers. So the same can happen for ivory gulls. So that manifests in them not feeding their young properly, not being able to court properly and find a mate, not being able to feed properly for themselves, or on the other side, it's also an embryotoxin, so the eggs won't hatch. When it gets above a certain level, the embryo just can't develop. So that's what we would expect to see. When we expect to see that? Great question. We sort of figure on the current sort of trajectory that it's going, probably, if it's not there shortly, certainly within the next sort of 50 years, and you're seeing some major problems for ivory gull.
Wow. Even more than they're already experiencing, because you said the Canadian populations have somewhat crashed over the last 40 years.
Yeah, and we ultimately, we don't know the reason for that. So whether it's sea ice loss, which is of course climate change driven, whether it's illegal hunting, particularly in Greenland, although they've gotten a much better handle on that now, or whether it's mercury or other contaminants, or a combination, more likely a combination of all three. Welcome to ecology. Yeah, it's really tough, but yeah, the mercury certainly isn't doing them any favors.
Wow. Well, that's it's tough luck. Kind of the general trend for Arctic life at this point, it seems, is everything seems to be hammering them all at once, but that's particularly disconcerting.
Yeah, it is. And it's, I mean, the Canadian population is, in the grand scheme of things, relatively small compared with populations in Russia and in Norway. But we obviously have a huge stewardship obligation for the species in Canada. I mean, we're an Arctic nation, and these birds are quintessentially Canadian as blue jay or a chickadee. So, yeah.
Totally agree. So we're going to jump back down into the natural history collection side of this thing and get away from the really depressing thing, which has been a fairly running common theme for this episode so far, is birds dying in very terrible ways. So we're going to talk about a little bit how birds that have died can go to use to save other birds, by talking about the value of natural history collections. So one of the things that I read when I read this paper that I thought is interesting, and especially now reflective that you brought up the Mad Hatter thing, is that mercury is used in the preparation, or in the old style preparation of skins and such. And you had to work out how to get around, these potential contaminations from these specimens, from old 1877 specimens, to test what was actual mercury in the specimen, rather than what we have applied to it to keep the specimen stable for the next 150, 200 years. So how did you go about that? What was the strategy for getting around our messy application of too much mercury?
Yeah, so fortunately, you can separate out what mercury is bound to. So mercury, here's your chemistry lesson for the day. Mercury has a charge of +2 in its ionic form, and so it typically binds with 2 chlorine atoms. So you get mercuric chloride, or HgCl2. So that's inorganic mercury. Organic mercury is the mercury is bound to a methyl group, so a CH3 minus or CH3 plus group. So it has overall a charge -1. And it's this methyl mercury that's the nasty stuff for us and for birds. So the inorganic stuff isn't necessarily harmful. So, but the inorganic stuff is what we decided to put in the preservatives that kept these birds up until about the 1940s. So you can't just analyze all mercury, because then you're going to get things like 100 parts per million in 1890, which is clearly wrong.
How were these birds alive? These birds should have been toast.
if it wasn't in your natural history collection, it would have been dead. That's just, it's completely ridiculous. So, but this is something that's been known for a while. So, and you can analyze just the fraction that's bound to methyl groups. It's a lot more expensive, which is why we only did 80 specimens. and we had to work closely with Brian and his lab at Western to get that analysis done, because it's not at all straightforward. It involves a lot of digestions and analytical chemistry, and yeah, can be quite finicky, especially when you're working with a single feather, which is in these guys weighs about 15 milligrams. It's not a heck of a lot of material to work with. But yeah, so you can analyze just this organic fraction, which is the nasty stuff for the birds and the stuff that came up through the food chain, not stuff that was sort of piled on by curators of museums past.
Right. Who probably had a very bad time with it later. So what you guys were doing was,
depending on how you see it.
It's true. To them, it may have been not a terrible time until things got worse. Yeah. So you guys were having museums pluck a feather from specimens that you were looking for that kind of covered this big time range and a geographic area, I suspect. And they'd send you in the mail one of these feathers, and then you guys would dice it up and do all your chemical analysis on it?
Yeah, pretty much. So we often took two feathers, one for the, so we also looked at their diet, which we can use isotopes of carbon and nitrogen to look at that over time. And their diet's been flat. It hasn't changed. So they're feeding at the same trophic level now that they were in the 1870s. So we know that any increase in mercury is not because they've switched diets, but because of an actual genuine increase in the environment. So we usually took two feathers, and occasionally a third as sort of a backup. So you use one for the diet analysis for the stable isotopes, and then you send one off to the lab at Western for mercury analysis. So yeah, it's pretty amazing what you can do with just a single feather from a single specimen.
Excellent. This is exactly why we keep natural history collections around and why they need to be funded to be continuing to have this sort of thing, so curators have the time and the ability to go and help researchers from around the world help answer these broad-ranging questions.
Yeah. And so for collections that had a large number of specimens, I made a trip. So I was at the ROM in Toronto and the Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, for example, or museums that I just happened to be passing through on my way to other things. So they allowed us to go in and to work with the collections and to do this, what is ultimately destructive sampling. And in return, we acknowledge them in the paper and we send them the data that we generate, so that becomes tied to the specimen and its record for hopefully all of eternity.
Exactly. So nobody else has to come along and clip these feathers just to get the mercury 5 years from now.
Exactly.
So numbers won't have changed.
We've already got it. So you can either build on that or sample some other specimens to fill some gaps, or yeah. So it's really to the benefit. But I mean, this is a case of a paper that was. So it was published in Proceedings of the Royal Society B, which is a pretty good journal. And it's probably one of the papers I'm most proud of in my most proud of in my sort of young career, and completely and entirely done with natural history museums. It would have been impossible to do this any other way. We just would not know. So this is a brilliant example of why we need to have these collections maintained, properly curated, and continued into the future.
Awesome. So one more thing before we walk away from this, and I'm going to take credit for this because I feel like your prior visit to Breaking Bio did an excellent job of preparing you for a visit to, we'll call it a bigger and fancier and more listened to podcast. I think that's legit. Quirks and Quarks, the CBC's Quirks and Quarks, which as a fellow Canadian, I am ridiculously jealous of your appearance. And you did awesome on their show as well. So you and Bob McDonald had a hell of a talk. So what was that like? What was it like talking to Quirks and Quarks, and how did Breaking Bio do preparing you for the next level?
Look, I couldn't do the study without natural history museums. I would have never made the jump to Quirks if it had not been for Breaking Bio last year. So, sorry, I should have included that in my thank yous at the end. But we were really tight for time. and it got cut in the radio edit.
I'm sure it does. We appreciate the thought, though, and we knew you were right there with us. So,
so yeah, it was absolutely brilliant. So I was actually away at a meeting in Cambridge the day the paper came out. So when a paper comes out in this journal, you sort of have a week where you know it's ready. They tell you it's coming out. And you have a week where it's embargoed, so you can't broadcast it wildly. But people can call and talk to you, and journalists did. And it was, as someone who's never had really any media coverage aside from sort of the odd passing reference, and certainly no interviews for any of the work that I've done. It was really interesting to see that what the different takes on it were. So the BBC picked it up. The BBC World Service, I did a live interview at 5:30 in the morning.
As a bird person, I assume that wasn't terrible. That would be the death of me.
There's a reason I work on seabirds and not land birds that start chirping at 3 a.m. But yeah, and then quirks and quarks. So fortunately, at the RSPB, we've got essentially a room with a headset and a radio line or a phone line that's of radio quality. So it sounded like I was in a radio studio. So we just basically sat up there and chatted for about 15 minutes once we got the technical glitches sorted out, and then that was that, really. But I've also done I think it's called Science 360. It's a podcast from Edmonton that gets broadcast on radio stations, and including the NSF radio channel.
It's Science for the People.
Yes, it is Science for the People. That's right. Thank you. So I had a chat with them. Oh, that's horrible. No, I realized I'd forgotten their name.
It's a busy week. You were the Brad Pitt of gull research at that time. So,
yes, I had a great chat with Rochelle last week. So that'll come out in a few weeks. It was just really remarkable that this was what tweaked the interest of the media, given what we sort of internally think of as our most important contributions to science, and to see, in my mind, the disparity with what we think is important and what the public media sees as important it was an interesting lesson, I think, as well.
Sweet.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I'm glad that you were there, and I'm glad that you were so well prepared from talking to us here.
Couldn't have done it without you.
Exactly. So last time you were on, nobody really knows this, but last time you were on, we asked a question that you weren't allowed to answer, or at least you felt you weren't allowed to answer
Right.
at the time. And I don't remember what the question was. It doesn't matter what the question was. The fact was that you weren't allowed to answer it because of who you were working for at the time, which would be the Canadian government, who has been fairly draconian lately, the past several years, in their approach to environmental science and the media, mostly environmental science. Would you like to potentially answer that question and related versions of it?
Well, I mean, don't answer on the issue. So I was the last sort of year-ish of my postdoc, I was with Environment Canada, which meant that I was under the same basically regulatory umbrella as Canadian government research scientists. So that included the inability to speak publicly about our research without getting approval from sort of the highest levels of bureaucracy. And yeah, I can't remember what the question was. I think that Heidi asked me last time. But yeah, long story short, the tradition continues. Canadian government scientists still can't speak publicly about their research. And in a slightly chilling shadow or echo of that, policies of a similar nature are being introduced in the UK. just recently for some of our government-based scientists, as was reported in The Guardian last week. So yeah, it was. I mean, obviously, it's a horrible thing, and something that really irked me at the time. As someone who enjoys outreach and talking about the science that I do, and engaging with other people about it. Unfortunately, as a postdoc, I was low enough on the totem pole that I didn't have things like handlers at conferences or things like that. But had I been at Environment Canada when this ivory gull paper had come out, I would have not been able to say a single word. So yeah, so Brian, our co-author at Western, would have done all of the media requests about it. So, which absolutely sucks. Yeah, so as I mean, being a government postdoc was an incredibly useful experience in terms of seeing how things worked from the inside. And there are definite advantages to being a government postdoc. And I really enjoyed my time there. And the colleagues that I worked with on the science side were absolutely brilliant, and I continue to work with them. But the framework in which they are placed is very challenging, is very, in some cases, very backwards, in my opinion, and not necessarily conducive to not conducive to communicating the results of this sort of public research to the public.
Yeah, which has, as we've discussed, especially with the Mercury work, has got global consequences. And it's not just your work. Obviously, it's a Canadian bird being researched by Canadian scientists, but the implications go far beyond just Canada in this sense. And so it's a travesty, really, that certain government policies, especially those currently in power in the Prime Minister Harper's cabinet, and the policies that they've indicted to make it difficult, whether we want to call it the more flammable terms of silencing scientists through bureaucracy. It's a fairly shameful issue, as I think, as a Canadian, to have a lot of my friends and colleagues who work in government not being able to talk about their work freely like this. Yeah, and I mean, it's the challenge is so you want to go present to a conference. Well, you might not get approval to go to the conference until literally a few days before, or even after the conference. Thus rendering it completely pointless, but they saved your travel money. Yeah, so it's a system that has a lot of problems with it, and unfortunately, the wheels of bureaucracy churn very slowly, and yeah, barring significant changes, I don't see it. I don't see it improving in the near future, but. Yeah, I mean, like I said, being a government postdoc was, for me, an absolutely fantastic experience. And the number of postdoc opportunities in Canada is very small. So it's an option that shouldn't be ignored. And hopefully, I know they were having some trouble with the visiting fellowship program. Hopefully they've got it figured out. I haven't heard. But this is a program whereby the government departments essentially gave money to NSERC, who employed the postdocs. And it worked, in my mind, worked relatively well. It put young Canadian scientists in government labs to do publicly funded research, which is what you would ultimately want. You want Canadian scientists working in Canada on Canadian and global problems. And it was absolutely brilliant, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah, there were some issues with employment benefits and how the postdocs were technically classified. So they're adjusting the program slightly. But long story short, there's a blog called Unmuzzled Science, which a few years ago published a really great account that sort of mirrored a lot of what I experienced as a government postdoc. So if anyone is at all interested in pursuing
government postdoc in whatever the visiting fellowship program turns out to be, you should check that out, and then chat with other visiting fellows, government postdocs, to see what their experience is. But it's on the whole a very good experience, because you do get to see what goes on behind the scenes, which can often be slightly different from what's portrayed publicly.
Yes, and just to reiterate, I have no problem with government researchers. I know a lot of them. They're all great. They do great work. It's just the bureaucracies above their heads that are holding them back in some regards, especially when it comes to this side of things. So,
yeah, I mean, they're of the same caliber of researchers as we have in universities and NGOs and industry. So as someone now who works in an NGO, so outside of academia and outside of government, I mean, I have a mandate to research certain things. So my research is on conservation issues on Tristan da Cunha and Gough, which is absolutely fine. And in government, it's very similar. And I mean, you just look at the publications that come out, and they're of the absolute best quality. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with the science that goes on in government labs. It's just the system in which they work is not necessarily conducive to science in general, or a lot of other things like libraries.
yeah, there is all kinds of stuff going on with that as well. But I think we've had enough depressing comments for one day, so maybe we'll wrap it up there. This has been a little extra long than usual as well, but I want to thank you, Alex, for sitting around and telling us so much about what you've been doing. So where can people keep track of your ever-changing and adventurous lifestyle over the interwebs and following you to the most remote places in the world?
So I'm on Twitter at the Lab and Field. Yes, you can tweet from Tristan da Cunha, and I'm fairly certain I'm the first person to send a tweet from Gough, although the internet there is slightly more dodgy. You can also find me at labandfield.wordpress.com, or if you Google the RSPB Center for Conservation Science, you'll find all about the work that we do in the overseas territories and on conservation issues globally and in the UK.
Awesome. That sounds great. And like usual, if you're listening at home or watching on YouTube, you can find all these links. We'll be good and kind and put all these links to all of Alex's stuff, including the paper on ivory gulls and links to his Quirks and Quarks episodes. You can compare how well he did here compared to talking with Bob McDonald. We'll put all of that stuff on our website, which you can find at breakingbio.com. So thank you, Alex. I wanted to thank you so much for coming back and joining us and enlightening us about all that is going on around the world with you and your research. For everybody listening at home, we owe a big debt of thanks to the European Society for Evolutionary Biology, who helps us cover some of our monthly costs to keep the podcast running. And if you want to keep track with us, you can find us on Twitter by looking for @BreakingBio. You can find us on Facebook by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast. And you can listen to us and all of our old episodes either on YouTube by searching for the Breaking Bio podcast, or you can find us on iTunes and Stitcher, depending on which resource and use you like to find your podcast at. So you can find us all there. And again, like I said, breakingbio.com is our home. You can browse through all of our old episodes and find all the show notes, linking you to all sorts of other information. So I want to thank Alex one more time for joining us this week, and everybody at home for listening. And hopefully you'll join us next time when we have a brand new guest.